We're talking with Georgina Downer from the Institute of Public Affairs. Good morning to you both. Thank you so much for speaking with us on Weekend Breakfast. And let's begin with this issue around Australia Day, the date. Of course, also now looking at whether or not we need to re-examine plaques and statements associated with historical statues, in particular in Sydney, those concerning James Cook and Governor Macquarie, which have been vandalised already this morning. James, what do you make of what the Prime Minister has had to say at this stage about him not wanting to see any changes, and that would effectively rewrite history? Yeah,
I mean, I suppose there's two things here, and we shouldn't confuse them. One is the vandalism, which is an unfortunate event and totally unnecessary, and the other one is having a revision or a review or discussion around Australia's history. And I suppose taking Stan Grant's line is, I mean, the history is a living, changing thing. It's always been changed, it's always been reviewed, it's always been altered. And I think it's, I think we're a grown-up nation that should be having those kinds of discussions. I mean, how do we view history 200 years on when, the doctrine at the time was that, the Pope announced that unless you're a Christian or a Catholic living in the civilised world, in inverted commas, then the world was open slather. So I think it is time that we have that conversation.
Georgina, do you feel as though some of these statues are an affront to many Australians?
No, not at all. I actually thought Malcolm Turnbull's comments yesterday spoke for the vast majority of Australians. These statues are an important part of our history, and while we have, of course, uncomfortable moments in our history, we should never seek to eradicate them, erase them. We need to preserve our history and understand that, monuments such as those in Hyde Park in Sydney were a product of their time, and if additional explanation is required, fine. But I think the deeper issue here is the teaching of history in our schools and universities is really failing us as a nation. That's a conversation I think is more important than trying to eradicate monuments to historical events in our past.
Well, I might get James to respond to that, because you are in the education system. What do you take to that?
I mean, there's nothing there about eradicating history. It's about discussing the multiple perspectives of history. I mean, I don't know what's more offensive, putting a jumper of St Kilda on Captain Cook, or having a discussion around what should the history look like. And I mean, again, it's not about obliterating history. It's about having a really an adult discussion of saying, from the history is written by the victors, and in hindsight we look at saying, well, this history was written from a very specific perspective. Now, saying that it's failing in schools, I think is taking a binary view, and I think it's a much too simplified view of saying this is a truth or this is a truth. There are multiple perspectives, and I think that's what I think educators are trying to get to these days. And I think saying that it's failing, or there's just one view or another view, and taking that second view from an Indigenous perspective is obliterating history. I think is a much too simplified perspective.
And Georgina, are we effectively shutting down that perspective? And whether or not we wish to talk about the Indigenous perspective, we are a minority of the population, of course, but a very important First Nations group to be acknowledged within the nation, I would have thought. But do we not just shut down this conversation by saying that this is effectively a whitewash, and not acknowledge that there is actually a whole other side to history which isn't being acknowledged here?
Well, I don't think that's the case. I think that there is a strong acknowledgement of our Indigenous past in this country and our Indigenous present. But to say, for example, let's take the case of the Captain Cook statue in Hyde Park, where the plaque says "discovered this territory." Well, that is actually true. Captain Cook was the first to traverse the eastern coast of Australia. There's nothing false about that statement.
The first European,
sure, but there's no record of an Indigenous person traversing the entire east coast of Australia. So in that respect, that is an accurate statement. I mean, should we have more monuments to Indigenous forebears? Well, maybe. That's something we can look at, but to take away statues that represent our colonial past, the beginning of white settlement in Australia, is almost to say, well, we're not proud of the fact that we do have a legacy that reaches back to the British Empire and all the benefits that settlement has brought to this country.
But it's not about, it's not about removing the statues, it's about contextualising, what happened.
So you say, essentially, as Stan Grant argued, that perhaps the plaques at least should be amended.
Yeah, they should be amended to kind of indicate that it wasn't just, there's all, we do know that the history of discovery or of interaction is much more complex than someone arriving and sort of being the first on this land. You can look at all colonial countries all over the world. We've discovered that it's much more complex than the first European landing and placing a flag. There's been centuries of interactions, and I think we need to recognise that complex history. And I think it's really important. I think if anything, what it does, it opens up a much richer and much more vibrant history and interaction than any and something that we can be more proud of than just sort of saying this was a passive country here, and you had someone just arriving and indicating that this is now Queen and country.
All right, well, we're going to move, James and Georgina, to, of course, the issue of same-sex marriage, and, of course, that is gaining momentum in the community. We're seeing record numbers of people enrolling or having their details updated. So, clearly, Australians do want to have their say on this issue. How do you feel, Georgina, about the way that this debate has unfolded? Because we've also seen a rising number of people approaching counselling services from the LGBTQI community, and reports that the Australian Christian lobby had suspicious white powdered packages delivered to them as well. So are you concerned about the way that this conversation has unfolded?
I'm not concerned about it, because I think in a democratic society like we live in, you're always going to have robust debate. That's sort of the very nature of the success of our society, that we do allow freedom of speech and a contest of ideas. So I think that's it, in a mainstream sense, that's to be welcomed. But of course, when you have instances like sending white powder to the Australian Christian lobby, or putting up signs that are really incredibly derogatory of the gay community in Australia, then that is unhelpful. But I would just say they are absolutely in the margins, those instances. That has not been the mainstream campaign, and I think the nature of the campaign has, at the sort of top level, has been very respectful. Of course, people are very heartfelt and passionate about their particular positions, but we should expect that.
James, do you feel as though at the very least this has promoted a constructive conversation?
Oh, look, I think more than anything it's promoted the fact that, it's a massive political failure. Like, we elect governments to make decisions, and this is something that should be legally, should be discussed in Parliament. That's what we elected them for. And I think it's a $122 million, backing out of Parliament taking responsibility. Is it worth having these discussions? Yeah, of course it's worth having these respectful discussions, but this is just a government or a Parliament that has an inability to make a really, really important decision, a decision that they're empowered to make. And if this government, and I'm not just picking on the Turnbull government, but if a government doesn't want to make a decision, then just stand on those legs and just say, look, we don't believe in it, we're not going to go ahead with it.
Do you have any particular concerns about the outcome? Should it go either way, or be a close vote, or perhaps not many people turn up to vote? Well,
look, I think the statistics of 100,000 new voters indicates that people are passionate and are getting into the debate. And I think, the problem is that even no matter which way the vote goes, people with that are really passionate about have indicated that they're not going to necessarily follow the direction of the plebiscite. So it really is not. It's really a high-powered or a very expensive opinion poll. Is essentially what we've come up with.
All right, we are running out of time, but Georgina, I just wanted to also cover on the issue of executive pay. This past week, we've seen revelations of just how much some of our executives are paid, of our major companies, that they're among the highest paid in the world. Are they worth it?
Well, that's up to their shareholders, actually. And in Australia, we give shareholders a huge amount of power to knock off a board if they're not very happy about the level of remuneration going to the key group of executives. It's called the two-strike rule, and that's being increasingly used. And it'll be interesting to see at the Commonwealth Bank's AGM next year whether they use it to they're unhappy with the level of remuneration of the CBA executives. I'm very relaxed about this. I think, in a way, Australia is well served by being able to offer high remuneration to attract the best and brightest talent to lead these companies, which ultimately the shares in which are owned by our superannuation fund. So it's in our interest that these companies do really well.
And for you, James, of course, among those who we've seen the details of their earnings, Ahmed Fahur, who was, of course, the Chief Executive of Australia Post, in Narev as well from the Commonwealth Bank. These two gentlemen have come in for quite a bit of criticism.
I think it was the golden handshake.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I have no problem with executive pay packages if people earn it. And, I think it was the Superannuation Investment Group said that only 8% of executives fail to earn it this year. So maybe the bar's a little bit too low. Maybe if you're 8% is probably, it's indicating that they're not really, the boards aren't really doing their jobs in negotiating what really those levels should be.
But do you think the average Australian who are experiencing this, we talk about stagnant wage growth, they're struggling to reconcile this?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the challenge, isn't it? Convincing the public that someone is worth $12 million a year when they haven't experienced, or when you're cutting holiday, weekend penalty rates. So I think, I think if there is an argument to be made that these executives are worth it, it's an argument that's not being made very well. I mean, you can look at something like Joyce's recent pay with the Qantas turnaround. I mean, that indicates that he's taken a struggling company and he's turned it into something that's really viable. So you can sit there and say, well, that's worth it. But what have some of these other executives done in boards that kind of reflect? Boards are often their mates, right? So it's also it's also very kind of doesn't quite give that independent feeling that sort of Georgina alluded to, I'm afraid. All
right, well, we haven't been able to delve any deeper into that particular issue at this point. It will be great to talk with more issues in the future. Georgina Downer and James Avanitakis, wonderful to have you with us. Thank you both so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.